In the wizard-ruled kingdom of Finis, a lengthy war of royal succession has been brewing, but tonight, it will finally come to an end, impacting the nasal bone at a specific angle and causing a brain injury. At that point, being a magic user stops mattering, since after, with concern etched on her face, his mother asks him if he is still worried about the path he will take. Then, he remembers that, at 15 years old, Gallic men must decide their future. At this stage in their lives, they face three options. First, to take on low-paying jobs within the Gallic town. Second, to abandon the town and subject themselves to forced and dangerous labor, enduring constant contempt. And third, to become a mercenary. Although the NW, Gallic people do not possess magic, many of them have physically strong bodies. Furthermore, because they cannot be detected by magic, they can effectively serve, effectively as scouts or spies. When the kingdom goes to war, Gallic mercenaries are typically the first to be sent to the front lines, treated as disposable assets and effective pawns of the army. However, if they manage to survive the war and its missions, they will be. Guarantees high compensation. His mother hugs Van with tears in her eyes, crying for the safety of her son, who has declared his decision to become a mercenary. She won't say that the path he has chosen is wrong. After all, they are able to eat today thanks to the fortune her husband earned on the battlefield. But since he is her only son, she can't help but worry. Many Gala men decide to become mercenaries to earn fortune, even knowing that it is a dangerous life. Van had already chosen that path in his previous life, and that was how he met Inez. In the present, after all, they are still humans and can die from serious injuries. Then, he faces a wizard who casts a spell intending to eliminate him. However, Van is faster. As they happily continue with the celebration, the village bell rings, signaling danger. Van immediately realizes that something is happening, and he rushes into the village, warning his mother and sister to stay away for a while. Ignoring their questions, he sprints towards the town. Meanwhile, in the city, members of the Purification sect, a fundamentalist group within the kingdom's dominant religion, are hunting down the Gala. This group is considered extremely radical and is labeled as heretical, even by the church itself. They view the Gala as sinners and as an impurity born from darkness. One of their core doctrines is to identify servants of demons and eradicate them. Van remembers that on the day of his 15th birthday, the Purification sect, already branded as heretical, fled to his region, an autonomous region in name only, with a weak security, allowing the sect to easily seize the town and commit all sorts of atrocities in the name of purification. Back then he could only hide with his family. But now things are different. He now possesses the martial arts skills he retained from his past life. He slips in from behind, as the sect continues its purification of the town, dousing people with flames they claim have the power to cleanse sin. Taking advantage of the carelessness, Van surprises a member of the sect and attacks with swiftness. It's undetectable, one of the basic skills used by an award-winning mercenary. He's quick and manages to land a kick, breaking the wizard's jaw in the process. As a result, he dislocates the maxillary suture, causing the magician to against magicians. Once the enemy is trapped, the assassin must damage the brain and the spine. If those vital points are attacked first, the wizards will die before they can even use their magic. With that, Van easily takes down the cult member, causing commotion and an uproar among the others. Another member attempts to attack him, raising his sword to stab him, but Van anticipates the attack and plunges the blade into the attacker's chest. The man falls lifeless to the ground. Weapons imbued with magic can penetrate magical defenses, and since Van doesn't possess one, he plans to use his enemy's weapons against them. Another member attempts to use magic against him, but Van is far too quick. With his superior agility, he strikes first, causing the man to drop his staff. While the man is vulnerable, Van attacks again, completely defeating him. He then turns his attention to the three remaining members, determined to eliminate them once and for all. Suddenly, a voice rings out, ordering him to halt. Van looks up and sees another cult member dragging a woman while menacing her with a weapon. He commands Van to kneel, or he will kill the woman. Van struggles with himself internally, realizing there are more cult members present than he had anticipated. He attempts to stall for time, but the man threatens to kill the woman once more. Ultimately, Van yields, raising both hands as a sign of surrender. Witnessing this, the man commands the others to beat the boy. He then shouts at them to stop wasting time and just kill him, without writhe in pain. Van mocks him for taking so long to recite his incantations. After that, he jumps and launches another attack, completely defeating him. However, they disagree. Van has killed their comrades, and they want to make him suffer before ending his life. The man insists, saying that it gives him a bad feeling. Since the others continue to refuse, he pushes the woman aside in frustration and decides to kill Ban himself. At that moment, the woman appears and uses ice magic against the cult member, freezing him instantly. Her mere presence commands respect, and she is escorted by guards. She warns him not to move carelessly, because if he breaks, she won't know how to fix him. She then declares that she has arrived by order of the kingdom to hunt down the purification sect and place them under arrest. Ban is stunned, since in his previous life, reinforcements from the capital had taken much longer to arrive. The woman encases everyone within her ice, completely immobilizing them. The frozen man orders the others to free and kill the woman, but it's no use. Then, she orders the guards to confiscate the weapons from the cult members. Later, as the guards lead the frozen members away, the woman confronts Ban. She finds it interesting that he managed to defeat 3 magicians from the purification sect alone. Magicians of the purification sect. She seems to have something to say about his abilities, but decides to thank him first. She points to the dead Flames, who could have reduced the entire town to ashes if he had wanted to. At first, Helen was thinking about how to deal with that. The prince is stunned to see that Van has defeated both his swordsman and his magician without using magic. Van points out that non-magic users like himself can, it's not that she couldn't have defeated him if she had fought, but she preferred to avoid casualties as much as possible. Therefore, she admits that the surprise attack, Ban's assistance was a great help, and thanks to it, they managed to avoid casualties. Upon hearing this, Van realizes that the kingdom acted more quickly because he defeated the fire mage. Then, she asks him what reward he desires. However, Van rejects the offer, telling her that she was the one who saved his life. He even thanks her to express his gratitude and sincerity. Impressed, Helen extends her hand and asks him his name. Van introduces himself, and the woman introduces herself in turn as Helen. Then, she invites him to accompany her to the Magic Academy, which leaves the boy completely surprised. The Magic Academy is a boarding school founded by 3 nations with the purpose of recruiting talented individuals. Regardless of whether the person is a commoner, a foreigner, anyone can enter as long as they pass the entrance exam. Ban had heard of the academy in his previous life. Most of the heroes and great magicians were graduates from there, which is why he doesn't understand why she's offering him such a valuable opportunity. Since there are royal guards nearby, Helen tells him that it would be better to talk in private, and she takes his hand to lead him to a quieter place. He smiles and admits that it's his first time in the area, so he can also act as her guide. Later, they arrive at a serene lake where no one can overhear their conversation. Helen looks, without a doubt, defeat magicians. Enraged, the prince asks him if he is an assassin hired by Inez. Van admits that he is a murderer, but clarifies around and asks if anyone would know if a person died in that place. In an unexpected move, she materializes a bow and arrow out of ice and points them at the boy. Van moves swiftly and appears behind him. Helen is surprised by his agility, especially when she realizes that he didn't use magic, but only pure physical technique. He managed to break her line of sight and position himself in her blind spot. Van takes her hand, but immediately releases it when he realizes that she was only testing him, as he didn't sense any murderous intent. Helen laughs at his remark, impressed that, being so young, he already has so much experience. She admits that she likes to test people, and that she has now confirmed that he possesses the ability to confront magicians using only physical techniques. Suddenly, it occurs to her that Van could change the current situation of the Galdas and enter the academy. Van is silent for a moment, then realizes Helen is referring to academic knighthood. Helen confirms this and confidently asserts that he could be eligible to receive an academic knighthood. Academic knighthood is a system designed to reward students who achieve outstanding results. During his time at the academy, knights, regardless of their social background, earn the right to establish a new noble house within the kingdom. The territory awarded is usually connected to the recipient's origins, implying that Van could even be granted Gala Chanon if he, who hasn't been hired, he's simply doing it as a favor for a friend. The prince refuses to believe a non-magical person could be friends with royalty and obtains the title. This had never been a possibility for him. Unlike his previous life, he hasn't yet exceeded the age limit to take the income. However, he has 3 questions. The first is, does the exam require a recommendation from a noble of the kingdom? Before he can speak, Helen immediately offers to write one for him. The second question is whether he could still receive the title of knight despite not possessing magic, since such a case has never occurred before. Although it is true that those who obtained knighthood in the past shared something in common, they transcended traditions, reached new principles, from the discovery of magical medicine to advances in magic circle research. Using magic is not the only path. After all, subduing magicians without relying on magical power is also considered a great achievement. His unique ability fits perfectly into that idea. If he manages to get everyone to acknowledge his talent, he could become the first Gala to obtain knighthood. Finally, Van asks him what his objective is in all of this. Why go to the trouble of helping him? He knows she isn't doing it simply because she wants to see him succeed. Ellen smiles and asks him if he doesn't find her trustworthy enough. Van admits that she seems like someone who likes to be in control. He wants to know her true intentions and understand why she is pushing him to become the Lord of the Gala. Ellen is silent for a moment and then refuses to reveal her, mocks his background and lineage, claiming that because he is a Gala, he is nothing more than trash and cattle, and could never be a friend to royalty. As he walks away from Van, real reason. The silence lingers between them. Just then, Lena appears and asks what he's doing by the lake. Van is surprised to see his sister, who had heard about his fight against the sect in the village, reassures him when she sees his worried expression, telling him that everything is all right. With tears welling up in her eyes, Lena embraces her brother tightly, burying her face in his chest as she tells him that she and their mother were very worried about him. Helen tells B that he doesn't have to trust her immediately, but if he accepts the knighthood, he will have the means to protect his mother and sister, in addition to the honor it could bring to his village. Following his conversation with Helen, his mother confronts him about fighting the purifiers, appearing both shocked and terrified for his safety. However, after hearing the townspeople thank him for saving their village, he feels nothing but pride, thinking that Van truly takes after his father, and praises him for doing good and helping others. Then they talk as well, from the academy, and both women are surprised to hear that Van wishes to study at a school in the capital. He explains that even someone like him, coming from Galda, can sign up, and tells them about the reward he could potentially get with a recommendation from a noble like Helen. Finally, he communicates his decision to enter the academy. They are astonished to hear this, knowing that the school is primarily intended for magic users, asks how much he was paid, and offers to double or triple the amount in exchange for his loyalty. However, Van decides to end his life for insulting non-magical people of magic. Van clarifies that, even so, he will be recognized within the institution, and that he wants his race to no longer feel inferior to magicians. For days, he reflects on making the right decision. In this life, it's pointless to become a murderer again, especially since that only happened when he was dating Inez. This time around, she definitely won't walk alongside him, but she also understands that she can't confront the kingdom on her own without a plan. She still doesn't know Helen's true intentions, but if he accepts her offer, it could help him take a completely different path than he did in his previous life. Since he has already died once, he now has more courage to take risks. If there is even the slightest glimmer of hope, he will seize it. With a determined look on his face, he tells his family that he will definitively eradicate discrimination against their race. For a moment, his mother sees her husband, his father, reflected in him, a trait they both share. With the same determination, she understands that she cannot stop him. A small tear falls from her eyes as she says that stubbornness runs in their family blood, and that she knows he will do the right thing, never doubting him. Van thanks his mother for supporting his decision. However, she turns serious and asks if he has already considered how he will pay his school fees. He panics upon realizing that he had completely forgotten about that detail. His mother sighs deeply and says that she will find a way to cover his expenses at school. Hearing this, Lena offers to work as well in order to give her brother money. Magical people. Shortly after, the death of the second prince is officially announced as the result of an illness, and the funeral takes place. Van stops them, telling them not to work for his sake, and he begins to worry about their situation, aware that there are no good jobs available, paid in gala as he can get. However, the money problem is soon resolved when Helen hands over the reward she received for defeating the Purification sect. With this, money is no longer an obstacle to entering the Magic Academy. Several weeks go by, and Van is ready to begin his new life in the city. His mother reminds him that he will meet people who will make fun of him for being gala, but that he must persevere without feeling inferior. She wants him to live with dignity, because he is her pride and joy. Van promises to do his best. Lena chimes in, telling him that when he returns, she will be sure to cook his favorite mushroom soup for him. Van ruffles his sister's hair and tells her that he will be back soon. He bids farewell to his family, thinking that this time he will fulfill his promise. Later, he finally arrives at the prestigious Magic Academy, a place where many young aspirants like him gather. To take the entrance exam, a young man approaches the guard at the entrance and introduces himself as a nobleman from the Hebge family, having been recommended by his father. The guard bows before him and allows him to pass. Another candidate with a recommendation appears and receives the same treatment. Then, it's the turn of Van, who is greeted with shouts from the guard for daring to approach the academy. Onlookers notice his red eyes and immediately judge him to be the second prince, seated on the throne, commands his most loyal servants to eliminate Inez, the ninth prince, who is his greatest threat to the throne, solemnly, bringing the long-running intrigue surrounding the blind woman to an end. Elsewhere, Van visits his good friend, the ninth prince, Inez, who thanks him, someone impure because he is Gala. Van tells the guard that he hasn't done anything wrong and that he simply wishes to take the exam. The guard replies that he doesn't know where. B retorts that anyone is allowed to take the exam, regardless of their social standing. The guard aims his spear at B's neck, warning him that he's overstepping his bounds. Despite having a weapon pointed at him, Van feels more annoyed than frightened. Observing the people present, he realizes that he won't be able to take the exam if he causes a scene. Then, a senior guard intervenes, stating that violence shouldn't be incited in front of the applicants. Van is relieved to see someone reasonable. Unfortunately, the older guard calls him delusional for even attempting to take the exam. He explains that while the academy doesn't discriminate based on status, the exam still requires a letter of recommendation from a noble of the kingdom. Van shows him the letter. The guard examines it closely, noticing that it even bears the nobleman's seal. The other guard accuses him of forgery and tries to snatch the letter away. Van knocks him to the ground to stop him. The senior guard asks what happened, as neither he nor the others witnessed the attack. Just then, one of the examiners, Klaus, appears and asks what's going on. His presence commands such respect that the guards immediately kneel. Immediately. After hearing what happened, Klaus asks, "Who is Van?" Van introduces himself, mentioning that he was recommended by Hall standards. The mere mention of the name leaves, for eliminating his brother, because thanks to that act, he will become the next king. Van congratulates him and asks how he feels about having everyone in shock. Klaus carefully reads the letter and confirms that it legitimately comes from the Steiner family. He apologizes for the treatment Van received and allows him to enter. People murmur in surprise, seeing a family member interested in recommending someone to a gala. Inside the campus, Van observes that the other applicants are elites. He recognizes one boy as the future Grandmaster Swordsman and others as future high-level mages. He remembers how they all became heroes of the kingdom while he remained in the shadows. He also remembers how they ended up being mere pawns of the second prince during the succession war. The night he killed them remains vivid in his memory. Now he understands that, in this new life, he must compete with those who are in the spotlight. He is confident that if he can face the stars as an equal, perhaps he can change the world. Kingdom. One of the applicants, named Folk, approaches Van and tells him that he has no right to be so calm inside the academy. Van replies that standing still isn't a crime. That response infuriates Folk, who insists that someone from a gala like him has no right to be there. Van thinks that it would be easy to lower his head to avoid trouble. However, he remembers his mother's words. He must never feel inferior. He also recalls how Inez, in his past life, told him to never lower his head if he wanted the day of equality to arrive. Folk, irritated that Van isn't paying attention to him, finally achieved his dream after so many years. Inez corrects him, reiterating that it is a shared dream, and swears that when he ascends to the throne, she will lifts him into the air as if he were a child. Van warns him that he was the one who attacked first, then grabs Folk's wrists and forces him to fall onto his back. Knees. He explains he's using his opponent's own strength to manipulate their movements, the same technique he used earlier with the guard. The observers are stunned to see FK kneeling. To add to the humiliation, Van smiles and offers him a hand up. FK swats his hand away and activates a magic circle to attack. Suddenly, an authoritative voice orders him to stop. The voice belongs to Inez, who appears as an angelic figure and advises FK not to antagonize others simply because he is Galda, and that he should always aspire to peace. FK bows before Inez and apologizes. Inez tells him that he doesn't need to be so formal and asks him to treat her like any other applicant. B Queen, seeing Inez in her younger version, The applicants recognize the ninth prince and are impressed by his humility in taking the exam like everyone else, as well as his apparent tolerance towards the gala. Van remembers Inez once telling him that she had attended the academy. Inez spots Van and offers him her hand as a sign of friendship between fellow applicants. Van thinks about how welcoming her smile is, but he can't see her in the same light anymore because he now knows the dark truth hidden behind it. Van wants to kill him right then and there, but he tries to contain his anger and concentrate. Discriminatory policies against the Gallic race. She will ensure that no one ever calls them livestock again. They bump fists to seal their promise. On the reason why he came to the academy in the first place, he turns away and tells the prince that he didn't come to the academy to make friends. He lowers his hand, stunned. Viewers think Van is being rude, which isn't surprising given what they think of him. Galazar, Folk, who is present, grits his teeth furiously as he glares at Van. Klaus appears to announce that registration is over and informs the intel applicants that they will be guided to the exam location, known as the Forest of Shadows. The group arrives at the forest's edge. The other examiner, Ren, tells them that the forest will be the location for the entrance exam, explaining that the environment will test each applicant's power. Ren continues by saying that the Forest of Shadows contains a huge amount of magical energy, and their mission is to collect a flower imbued with magic and bring it back. Tears of Heaven. He notes that numerous beasts with magical powers inhabit the forest. Fren clarifies that interfering with others is not allowed. Aspirants can cooperate and form groups, provided that each member only brings back one tear of heaven. The time limit. It will be until sunset. Klaus informs them about the guardian badge they must wear before entering the forest, which they can destroy if they find themselves in danger, so an examiner can immediately come to their aid. However, he warns that requesting rescue implies Prince invites him to his coronation night, but Van responds that it would be best not to attend because it could negatively affect his image as the new king. Inez. Immediate disqualification. The examiners officially announce the start of the exam. Several aspirants quickly form groups. Van realizes, who is the only one left alone, as nobody wants to team up with him. Even so, he doesn't care, believing that working alone is easier. Then, he approaches Bren to request his guardian badge. The examiner looks at him with disdain, but hands it over nonetheless. As Van ventures into the forest, FK stares intently at him. Inside the forest, Van encounters a demonic beast, a green bear. He immediately recognizes that demonic beasts are animals with formidable magical power, often far more dangerous than humans. The bear immediately lunges at him, and Van delivers a punch, straight to the chest. He calls his attack Crushing Blow, explaining that it utilizes force waves generated by the impact to break through superficial defenses and cause internal injuries. The bear foams at the mouth and falls lifeless to the ground. Van glances behind him, realizing he's being followed. The two individuals who were following him hurriedly hide behind a massive tree. Van is annoyed by how poorly they're trying to conceal their presence. Behind the tree are Folk and his partner, Alex. Folk believes Van used poison to defeat the bear and despises him for resorting to underhanded Gallic tactics. Alex asks if he really intends to attack Van when the rules forbid interfering with other aspirants. Folk replies that he's certain there will be no, insists that she will not allow that to happen, and emphasizes that she needs her friend to be there. However, Van ultimately declines the invitation, fearing consequences, as he doubts the examiners would allow a gala to pass, especially one who was rude to the prince. He smiles at. Imagine killing Van without suffering any punishment whatsoever. Meanwhile, Examiner Bren finds himself in a huge dungeon, being guided through its corridors by a guard. He stops in front of an iron cell, and Bren asks for the key. He assures the guard that there is no reason to fear the beast locked inside, since they control it through magic. He reveals that the creature will only attack Van. He claims that it would be a stain on the Academy's honor to allow a show-off like him to pass the exam. He explains his plan, to make it look like Van died from a natural accident during the test. The guard asks what will happen if other applicants are injured. Bren assures him that no one will side with Van because he is a gala, so there will be no more victims. Bren opens the cell and orders. The beast eliminates the filthy gala for the Academy's pride. From the darkness, the creature's gleaming eyes appear. Claus is at the forest entrance, observing the sky. When he senses approaching danger, Bren returns to the forest, and Klaus asks him where he's been. Bren replies that he was just preparing the next phase of the exam. His smile makes Klaus suspicious. Meanwhile, Van discovers a cluster of sky-tier flowers. He thinks that just one of them will be enough for the test. Then he turns around and orders his bullies to come out, FK and cause problems for him as the new monarch. He prefers to wait patiently for people to change their way of thinking about the gala, even knowing it won't be easy. Alex reveal themselves. FK is surprised that Van detected them and insults him, comparing a gala's sense of smell to that of a dog. FK retorts that he has experience dealing with cowards who attack from the shadows, noting the irony of their words as he remembers his past life as an assassin. Folk declares that they have come to prove that the Galda are as valuable to the Academy as Van. Van retorts that he is just making excuses and that he actually wants revenge for having been humiliated in front of everyone. He asserts that he will beat that petty pride out of him. Enraged, Folk and Alex prepare for combat. Van identifies Folk as a spellcasting mage, while Alex is a sorcerer swordsman. He recalls that there are 3 types of magical combat. The first, caster mage who projects spells, the sorcerer swordsman who channels magic into their weapon, and the magical martial artist who strengthens their body by containing the magic within him. Van observes Folk's face and notices his nervousness, deducing that he doesn't have any experience with killing yet. He ironically praises him for at least having the courage to attempt murder. However, Van knows that he can't kill them. The death of a noble's son would cause their house to mobilize all of its resources to take revenge on his family. Furthermore, he decides that in this life, he will walk in the light. He won't kill them. Instead, he will force them to surrender by breaking their spirit. The more Folk looks at Van's red eyes, the more he hates him. He launches a powerful wind slash in his direction. Van dodges it. Although, the prince thanks him for his consideration and understanding, and suggests that he return home and rest for now, because the long battle has. His left arm is slightly cut. Folk congratulates him for dodging, but warns him that it will be difficult for him, since someone without magic cannot see the attacks. He's coming. He offers him mercy as he kneels and begs for forgiveness. Van replies that, to him, it was just a gentle breeze. This infuriates Folk even more, who launches another wind attack. Van easily dodges it. Folk doesn't understand how he can foresee his attacks, failing to realize that his murderous intent is so obviously leaking out. Suddenly, a punch lands squarely in his abdomen, hard enough to instantly knock the wind out of him. Seeing this, Ralph also prepares to fight, coating his sword with light. He launches an attack, but even from that distance, it's clear that it's just a basic enchantment. If the sword doesn't touch the enemy, it remains an ordinary weapon. It's not as simple as it seems, since the maximum speed of a sword's power is triple that of a punch. Still, Van's lightning-quick footwork was more than enough for him to take control of his opponent's wrist instead of his blade. In the blink of an eye, he positioned himself behind Ralph, still holding onto his arm, and delivered a quick, sharp blow to the blow joint. Both boys fell to the ground, defeated before they could do anything. The former assassin asks them if they wish to continue, but warns them that he won't hold back any longer if they do. His deadly gaze makes it clear that he means business, so Fork is quick to apologize and beg for mercy. Without finished, and now he can spend time with his family. Van smiles at the thought and thanks him for allowing him to take a vacation. Later, Van rests. However, his pleas are cut short when Van abruptly turns in another direction. They are both confused, but Van has sensed danger and knows with certainty. Certain that something is amiss, and realizing what it is, he urgently commands the 2 weaker boys to get away from there at once. A massive presence is approaching, leaving a trail of uprooted and fallen trees in its wake. It's already too late. They can only watch in horror as the creature attacks with its enormous tusks, sending them flying through the air. Even Van is taken aback by the unexpected enemy. It was the Hellboar, a demonic beast. There was no reason for a creature of such a high rank to be in that forest. The monster begins to paw at the ground, a signal that another onslaught is imminent. Also known as the Cursed Fang, its charge is said to be as devastating as siege magic. Understanding the situation is dire, Van orders them to flee immediately if they are still able to move. Ralph is stunned, but Folk says that there's no point anymore. The previous attack shattered his ankle. The swelling indicates a serious fracture. He can barely stand. Carrying him would slow them down too much, and facing the Hellboar would mean certain death. Furthermore, the beast has a habit of relentlessly pursuing its prey once it has marked them. They still have their insignia to call for help, but how long would it take for a rescue to arrive? Folk tells his friend to abandon him and flee on his own, in his dwelling while he cleans up. Then he enters his old study and sees the books piled up on one side of the room, and the mannequins. Feigning bravery, he claims that he can handle something like this by himself. It looks like Ralph is going to do it, but he surprisingly slaps. A companion smiles and says it would be a shame to abandon him. As they both demonstrate their bond, Vanos watches carefully and orders them to separate. He protects the badge while he buys time until rescue arrives. However, failing the exam in that manner would also tarnish the reputation of their houses. Nobles, rather than dishonor their families, they would prefer to die fighting the demonic beast. The scene might seem heroic, but to Vanos, it is not. Head, he reprimands them for being led astray by cheap pride. If they are going to fight, they should at least do it to win, with the pride befitting the nobles of the kingdom. The arrogance of Agalda irritates them, but there is no time for discussion. The beast charges again. Bren looks up, delighted, and, he murmurs, it was about time. Hearing him, Klaus asks what he means by that. Bren replies that he was just thinking out loud, and inquires if anyone has requested assistance with the badge. Upon being informed that no applicant has used it, he flashes a malicious smile, convinced that the boy didn't even have the chance to use it. The applicant's belongings were collected before the start of the exam, and Bren had retrieved a specific bag from the pile. Unbeknownst to the others, he had the hellboar memorize that scent and made him its target. Considering the beast's strength, his followers, honoring his wise decision, have been awaiting his orders to demonstrate their loyalty to him. The prince orders them to assault Inez's residence in the farm that he used to train with, all covered in dust. Then he realizes that the battle is truly over. Looking back, he remembers that it all began. The job should be done by now. All that's left is to wait for news. The evil examiner laughs to himself. Back in the forest, the boar growls and turns around. Digging into the ground, as expected, it attacks with all its power. B plans to stop it, creating an opening for the others to attack with their blows. Stronger, FK complains about Agalda giving them orders, but there's no time to argue because the beast could kill them all. B reacts and launches forward, to the front before the monster can gain momentum. Flexing his hand, he executes a crushing blow aimed directly at the creature's head. The force generates shockwaves that ripple through the area, leaving the applicants speechless. It is a technique that attacks the point of origin of the enemy's offensive movement. Enemy. In four-legged creatures, the first thing that moves when attacking is the head, as is the case with the wild boar. Still, the beast only roars, overriding it. Completed the damage. Due to the loss of muscle mass and weight after his regression, Van's current strength is insufficient, so he signals to his companions waiting behind. Swallowing his pride, Folk obeys and launches his cutting wind attack against the enemy's enormous body. At the same time, Ralph jumps high and unleashes his enchanted sword. However, like the others, his attack bounces off the thick fur, making it clear that all of their attacks are useless. Instead of being injured, the boar seems even more enraged. Van yells at them to get down. They barely manage to save their lives. When they were young and both dreamed of a different world. Therefore, Van became an undetectable killer thanks to his lack of magic, according to Agnes. When the beast rampages through the forest and throws them into the air, it hurts, no doubt, but at least they are still alive. Folk managed to slightly deflect the attack with his wind, but there will be no second chance. Ralph wonders if this is the end for him, especially since his sword couldn't even penetrate the monster's defense. However, Van refuses to give up and simply says that they will try one more time. They can't believe his confidence, but he assures them that, this time, they will put an end to the beast once and for all. Folk protests, insisting that none of their attacks worked even a little bit. Van then orders him to mix rocks with his wind to increase its killing power. Ralph, on the other hand, is instructed to concentrate on piercing a single point between the monster's ribs. They both ask him what he is thinking, as Van should understand that they cannot win, and he could even escape by using them. Wounded and used as bait. After all, they tried to kill him just moments ago, so he has no reason to hold back. But fortunately for her, Vanessa, he won't stoop to petty revenge. His goal is for his family and the entire Galda people to be recognized as part of the kingdom, and to achieve this, he cannot abandon his companions. They are from the same country. His words shock them with their bravery and heroism, and they can't help but remember how pathetic they were for trying to oppress the young man. Folk grits his teeth, filled with regret, not caring about the emotional moment. The Hellboar charges again. He sends the signal, always reminded him that the path to change would not be easy. They would have to face powerful swordsmen, magicians, and magical warriors, the prince warned, to attack. Following the order, FK unleashes a massive torrent of wind, mixing dust and debris into the air. The dark gust, filled with sand and gravel, lashed out at the demonic beast, successfully obstructing its vision. Now, Van could safely launch himself toward the target. He aimed for the thick fur on its spine, and secured a firm grip. The shoulder blades of quadrupeds differ from those of humans, as they are not directly connected to the vertebral column. This grants them a greater range of motion in all four legs but reduces their stability against unexpected forces. Employing the rotating launch harmony technique, Van flipped the beast over and slammed it violently into the ground. The unexpected maneuver stunned it momentarily, creating the perfect opening to attack the base of its front paw, where its heart is located. Ralph raised his reinforced sword above the target, but upon seeing the eyes, the wild boar hesitated for a moment. Convincing himself and gritting his teeth, he plunged the blade in with a loud war cry. For a moment, it seemed that they had truly won, but Van knew better than to get confident so quickly. Although the sword had pierced the flesh, it failed to reach the thick, throbbing heart. With an even more powerful beat, the hellboar unleashed a devastating roar, sending colossal shockwaves throughout the entire forest. Only a few beasts possess this special ability, a magic-charged roar capable of knocking down everything in its path. The young applicants were. He also pointed out that the fact that Van was a Gala placed him at a disadvantage, and he doubted that Van could beat masters who had perfected their magic. Hurled against the trees, which were uprooted, and the roar felt like it was tearing their insides apart. Ralph could no longer move. He was on the verge of death with the severely damaged internal organs. To make matters worse, the beast loomed over him, sizing him up as its first victim. Ralph knew he was going to die. Then, Van appeared between them, stopping the boar by grabbing hold of its tusks. Using the harmony technique, Spiral didn't take the force head-on, but dispersed it towards the ground with a circular motion. The boar stood its ground, enraged, refusing to allow the young man to divert its energy. Van considered using his last resort. He didn't know how much longer his weakened body could endure, but it was better than dying. There again, he yelled at the others to run for their lives. Finally, they obeyed and fled while the beast unloaded all of its weight onto the fragile, the young man's body. Instead of crushing him, the monster raised its head and launched its enemy into the air, slamming him against a tree. The others, they grew worried and wanted to rush to his side, but Van ordered them to stay back. With legs strengthened by fury, the hellboar charged toward the motionless young man. As Fultree approached him, Van gritted his teeth, forced to make a decision. He began an incantation, an energy. Darkness seeped from his body, and a demonic presence began to be released. However, something struck the boar before everything spiraled out of control. Confident in his abilities, Van stated that he would also learn magic, something Inez considered impossible. If he couldn't use it, then he would become. Beast was thrown sideways, saving the target just in the nick of time. Van immediately recognized the magic. Just as he expected, Inez was there, commenting that it had been a close call. The other two were stunned to see the prince, and immediately tried to get him out of that dangerous place. Unfortunately, his pride and his sense of duty as a member of the royalty compelled him to protect the citizens of the kingdom. His feelings were mixed, but they couldn't help but admire his principles. For his part, Van had already seen this countless times. He knew how Inez conquered the hearts of the people with words only to send them to their deaths. Addressing everyone, the prince proposed combining forces, but the former assassin bluntly rejected him. Bluntly. The others were horrified because they did not expect such direct insolence toward royalty, not even from him. Repeating his negatively, Van emphasized that his power wasn't necessary for that particular battle. The other two asked him to show some respect, reminding him that the prince had saved his life. On the contrary, El Galda asserted that they would have already defeated the beast if he hadn't intervened. His audacity was as shocking as ever. Instead of taking offense, Ian simply inquired whether they truly didn't need her help. Determined to prove his point, Van approached the recovered boar and told Ian to be quiet and observe, as royalty always does. The beast charged once more. Although everyone stood firm, the other two hesitated, hoping they could at least land a single blow. The person who best understood magic, in order to use that knowledge against magicians. He planned to compensate for his lack of magic through martial arts training. With a cool head, Van ordered them not to rush in. Dying now would be a waste of they had lives on the line. They only had one chance left, but it would be more than enough to succeed. Upon receiving the order to wait for their signal, both of them nodded and prepared themselves obediently. Meanwhile, Inez watched in silence. The moment had come to decide everything once and for all. B charged forward to intercept the beast. Although he had panicked before, he now knew that he could win without resorting to that technique. The hellboar attacked, but this time, with less ferocity than before. After failing 3 times, it had recognized the human group as a formidable enemy and was now advancing cautiously. This time, it launched an attack on Van with a hook, which he dodged easily. Barely managing to do so with the limited room for maneuver, the game of cat and mouse continued, while the others, they watched as the Galda skillfully dodged the enemy's massive fangs. It was difficult to believe he could move so quickly without using magic. Witnessing his movements for the first time, Inez realized that Van wasn't just fast. By manipulating his center of gravity, he had eliminated all preparatory movements. It was a technique exclusive to high-level martial artists, leading the prince to wonder who he truly was. In addition to constantly dodging, Van relentlessly counterattacked, accumulating damage, however small it might seem. It was a fierce assault, comparable to raging flames. Inez smiled, knowing that, as a rank B, she could achieve anything she put her mind to. In the present, Van feels nostalgic as he flips through the pages of, but the blows without magic were nothing more than caresses to the demonic beast. The boar roared in frustration. That was the only result. Apparent. However, that was precisely what Van was aiming for, to irritate it enough to provoke a specific movement. Finally, it had occurred. The hellboar opened its mouth wide, inhaling air to prepare its destructive roar, just as it had done before. Van then called upon the wind user, who launched his cutting wind directly into the beast's open mouth. Mixed with sand, the attack tore apart the vulnerable respiratory system of the beast, forcing it to writhe in pain and suffocation. But it still wasn't enough. Van closed the distance and, using both hands, unleashed a crushing blow. The impact struck the hellboar's thick skull head-on. The shockwaves generated from both sides converged at a single point. Inside the skull, it felt like 2 waves merging to create a much larger one. This time, the attack proved effective enough to cause the beast to foam at the mouth and lose its magical defenses. The moment for the final blow had arrived. Ralph raised his sword, concentrating all of his magical reinforcement on the blade's edge. With a deafening roar, he unleashed the strike and, to everyone's astonishment, cleaved the beast in 2. It was unbelievable, but the 3 boys had truly defeated the demonic beast. Then, they noticed Van shuffling his feet on the ground and inquired about what he was doing. Ian's eyes. An old magic book. He returns it to the stack and mutters that it really was a long and arduous battle. Later, Van heads home and attempts to buy, widened in surprise at the sight, but the young man disregarded the question and simply extended his hand toward Ralph, commending him for a job well done. Done. Ralph accepted the help, saying he was fine, and commenting that he had thought his organs had been damaged. The roar was imbued with magic, in order to disorient the ear canals, but covering the ears should negate its effects. It was something to keep in mind, although none of them wanted to do that again. Confront the wild boar. That being said, the beast was not the true objective of the exam. Banja was horrified to realize that the battle had destroyed most of the flowers in the place. Only 2 remained in good condition. As they had been warned, forming large groups brought complications. It was a terrible ending, especially because they no longer had time to look for more flowers. The 2 boys looked at each other with understanding, took the flowers, and, naturally, one was presented to His Royal Highness. While giving it to someone he had only observed might appear to be a form of flattery, it was simply what a vassal was expected to do. To Van's surprise, the other flower was given to him, a gallant figure who was generally disliked. Ralph acted nonchalantly, saying he simply didn't want to feel indebted to him. Recalling what had happened before, he added that his name wasn't just Wind User, and properly introduced himself. Ralph did the same, and asked Van to remember him. It was the first time Van had experienced such kindness from peers his own age, and he responded by extending his hand with a smile. Some fruit for his younger sister. He's about to pay when the merchant notices his red eyes, pointing to an anti-gala poster at the back of the. They likely wouldn't see each other again if they failed the exam. Inez's voice reassured them, saying there was no need to think that way. Then, they saw. The prince knelt in front of the fallen flowers, delicately touching them. Smiling, he infused them with his magic, bringing them back to life. Everyone's eyes shone as they witnessed the amazing power of light magic, receiving the flowers, which seemed to have bloomed after being bathed in the light of the sun. The boys thanked the benevolent prince. The scene felt unsettlingly familiar to Ban. Once again, the treacherous axe and the royal charisma had deceived a new group of followers. However, the sun was already beginning to set, so it was time to return to the exam's base. Undeterred by the obvious disrespect, Inez called him out, pointing out that he had covered his footprints with dirt earlier. Van wondered, what was that all about? The prince explained that it was an etiquette typical of assassins, hiding the traces of their techniques by relying on martial arts he had used, and the deeply ingrained habits he had displayed. The prince then asked if the boy was an assassin. The question froze the atmosphere. Inez had many enemies. The king had consolidated his power by taking princesses from conquered lands as wives. However, Inez's mother, who became the fifth queen, was already a noble and had been the first queen of the Frenaise kingdom. Therefore, her brothers and their mothers shop. He contemptuously declares that he doesn't sell to trash like him and snatches the copper coins right out of his hand. The other merchants begin to notice him and had the possibility of him ascending to the throne. So an assassination attempt wouldn't be strange, which was why he had attended the exam alone. If the boy in front of him was an agent sent by them, so he had to deal with the situation immediately. Ban remained silent, realizing that after the victory, he had lowered his guard and reverted to old habits. Calling himself a former assassin wasn't an option, leaving him no choice but to feign ignorance. The young man gave a nervous laugh, scratching his head and claiming he had no idea about such things. Inez wasn't someone who easily fell for such simple tricks, so Van changed his approach, telling him to think whatever he wanted. A tense silence filled the air as the weight of his words fell on everyone present. FK stepped between them, trying to reason with him, but before anyone could react, they saw the accused of appearing before Inez in the blink of an eye and grabbing her shoulder. Van claimed he was joking and told her not to look so frightening, so scary. As the others tried to grasp what had just occurred, Van smiled and asked the prince to excuse the villager's lack of manners. A villager. The prince observed him silently. He had intentionally left an opening, but other than shortening the distance between them, the boy did nothing further. Deep down, the former assassin calmed himself, remembering that he would forfeit any possibility of becoming a knight if he acted rashly. Secluded palace, killing all of his guards and servants without leaving any trace or evidence behind. One of his followers then draws his attention, claiming that he senses appear confused by his presence in the royal capital. They treat him as if he has some kind of contagious disease, fearing that if they get too close, they too will. Hastily, Inez wasn't offended by his words or his disrespect. However, she had one final question. She returned to the subject of concealing the footprints and asked him again if he wasn't a murderer. B responded that it was a trick that Helen had taught him, telling him it was essential for someone who relied on hand-to-hand combat. It was a lie, of course, but he had no other choice. However, the mention of the woman's name and her recommendation surprised everyone, especially since she didn't belong to any noble family. Van had thought she was haughty and distant, but the situation wasn't that simple. The ice flower was among the top 5 in the academy, so it wouldn't be strange for her to know assassination techniques. Furthermore, her house had served the kingdom for generations, so she had no reason to conspire against Agnes. When asked why someone like her would recommend him, Van vaguely explained that she had told him to apply for the exam. The prince deduced that he likely intended for Van to serve his house after graduation. In fact, he himself would have done the same if he had met him sooner. He waved off the boy's perfunctory thanks with a dismissive gesture. They will lose their magic. The ancient kings decreed that the Gala, the non-magical race, would serve as livestock for the Alul, the magical race. This is how. Furthermore, if there was a plot against his life, the demonic beast was most likely the instrument, as it would have killed him if he had encountered it without assistance. Gala looked away, saying she hadn't fought for him. Folk, fed up with his lack of respect, reprimanded the rude young man. Van responded with defiance. Instead of seeking reward or praise from someone who had lived surrounded by reverence his entire life, Inez showed a great interest in a man like that. The base of the examination area was full of aspirants. Some had passed after returning with the flower, just as they had been instructed. Others returned empty-handed, dejected, and wondering how they would explain their failure to their families. The examiners were waiting for the prince and 3 other people. Bren found it strange and asked what was happening. Originally, the forest was only supposed to contain beasts below the prince's level, as it was intended. Avoid injuries. However, the hellboar still hadn't returned, making him fear that something might have gone wrong. The people began to turn and to gasp as someone emerged from the forest. Bren also looked, expecting to see the prince. To his surprise, it was Bon, who he had believed to be dead after the demonic beast's attack. Demonic beast. He was stunned, unable to understand how Ban was still alive. Ban's sudden appearance shocked everyone on the field, especially Bren, who had committed a terrible act in an attempt to kill him. Klaus asked how the exam went, but the evil teacher made a slip of the tongue and asked, differences in social systems and evaluations based on the quantity of magic arose. Because of this division, the magical race began to, how the hell he was still alive, which made the others wonder why he was acting as if it were a bad thing. He tried to correct himself, saying that, I was simply impressed that he had survived on his own. Countering him, Van gestured behind himself, and everyone turned to see Folk and Ralph, dragging the enormous, severed head of the hellboar across the ground. The evil master could not believe what he was seeing. The applicants explained that they had brought her back because she might have been sent to assassinate the prince. Klaus was horrified that such a thing had even been possible, while Bren slipped up again by mentioning how he had failed to eliminate them. The crowd fell silent as his words reached their ears, but he dismissed them and told another lie, claiming he was simply impressed by their performance. At that moment, Inez appeared with a radiant smile and commented that it had been a truly magnificent battle. Her intervention disconcerted the teachers asked her if she had also participated in that dangerous situation. Upon hearing that she had been there purely by coincidence, Bren began to panic about what might happen next. Basically, he had sent a demonic beast against the royalty, and he would be finished if that ever came to light. The prince asked him if he was all right, since the professor seemed unwell. Bren downplayed it and praised Inez for having exploit the non-magicals, using them for life-threatening forced labor and as frontline troops in wars. Their only defeated a creature as powerful as the Hellboar. Exaggerating even more, he raised his hands and cheered for the kingdom, even though anyone could sense the suspicious nature of his attitude. The young prince reiterated that he had only been an observer and credited the accomplishment to the three boys, specifically pointing out that everyone would have died if Van hadn't been there. Murmurs of disbelief arose when Gala was mentioned, but Ralph supported him by saying that he knew a lot about magic and was an incredible person. Even FK openly admitted that they had fought and won under his command. Bren attempted to question him, but Inez intervened, saying that it was completely natural for someone recommended by Hallen Stanhard. In reality, she had not taught him anything, but that was the story they had to stick to. Meanwhile, the others watched in astonishment, trying to comprehend the lavish praise from the prince. Further supported by the Estonart's recommendation, they finally began to acknowledge Gala. Klaus, who had been impartial from the start, bowed his head to politely express his gratitude as a subject of the kingdom. He was sincerely thankful for what the boy had accomplished. Van considered, insisting that he had only counterattacked the beast, but decided against it, and proceeded to deliver the flower required to pass the exam. The other three followed suit, so Klaus turned to his fellow examiner, who cleared his throat involuntarily and announced their names. Equality was the heavy tax burden they shouldered. Whenever there was social unrest or threats against the monarchy, the Gala were the first to be blamed. Prince Inez, the nobles FK and Ralph, and finally, Gala Ban. Everyone confirmed their presence, and Bren formally acknowledged their admission into the academy. After a long and tumultuous afternoon, Van officially became a student at the academy. Aside from that, the prince ordered a thorough investigation and a comprehensive report regarding the demonic beast incident. Shortly after, all the new students were gathered in the main hall and received a welcome address from the director. What was required of them wasn't just magical talent, but, above all else, genuine nobility, needed to become the sword and shield of the kingdom when the time came. In his previous life, Van would never have imagined standing alongside nobles. It was a small step, but it demonstrated that the world was changing, and he would continue down that path until the day discrimination against the Gala was eradicated. From above, Helen watched carefully and soon walked through the halls of the academy. Upon reaching a door, she entered a room where 4 people were waiting for her, seated around a round table. After greeting them, she commented that everyone seemed to have arrived, but Karina reprimanded her for acting so haughtily when she had arrived late. Wasting no time, Amelia then asked why they had gathered there that day. Arnold replied that there was only one topic that the 5 shining crowns would discuss. Anis, the 8th prince, nodded and added that it concerned the substance, which resulted in massacres. The nation, of course, turned a blind eye to these unjust deaths. Even the natural disasters that plagued the country were foreigner that had infiltrated the academy. The way he phrased it was revealing. After all, for the first time since its founding, the academy had accepted a gala, a decision the majority of the 5 disagreed with, considering it a serious matter that needed to be addressed. To make matters worse, the person who had recommended his admission was one of them, and they demanded an explanation from Helen, who didn't even flinch at their words. The academy brought together sons and daughters of nobles, all possessing great magical power and immense pride, which often led to conflicts and duels. To maintain order, a group of idealistic students had formed a disciplinary organization known as the Five Bright Crowns. Helen was then ordered to explain why she had recommended the admission of a gala. She simply replied that she had recognized his strength, and nothing more. Karina even questioned the very idea that a gala could potentially be strong. For many, his people were cursed by God and therefore incapable of wielding true power. Despite her composed attitude, Amelia concurred with this belief, and inquired how someone without magic could possibly train to become the sword and shield of the kingdom. For those who do not possess magic, God does not exist, and that is considered common knowledge within the country. Challenging that common knowledge is convenient, and is often the excuse used to cease thinking and justify poor behavior. The prince felt insulted by the veiled insinuation directed at his family, but the woman remained unbothered by his attributed to those without magic. The unjust and inhumane history of his people sickens him. As he walks through the capital, cursed by the people, he wonders if one day, stern gaze. In light of this, Arnold suggested putting the boy to the test to see what he was truly made of. One way or another, they could confirm whether Van genuinely had the power needed to protect the academy. Annie was enthusiastic about the idea and asked if Ellen agreed with the proposal. If they concluded that he lacked strength, his judgment would also be questioned. Still, she didn't show any objections, didn't even care who they sent, and warned them that they shouldn't underestimate her protégé. While the prince scoffed at her arrogant words, Karina volunteered to take charge of the test. She said she would go all out, and he couldn't help but wonder if Van had somehow piqued her interest. Losing her smile, Karina declared that she simply wanted to crush the ice flower, along with his arrogance. Meanwhile, the young man in question was walking through the hallways of the academy. Everything seemed as normal as ever, with students attending classes, worrying about their rankings, and chatting with their classmates. A week had passed. Since Van had enrolled, he had surprisingly led a quiet life since then. Still, he had received a few greetings here and there. But no, long ago, the class was sitting in silence in front of the professor, who, with an unpleasant expression, called on Galdiano and asked him to explain the theory of the four elements in magic. Van remained silent for a moment, which was natural, since the question was far above the expected level. There will come a time when his people can live with smiles on their faces. Suddenly, he sees a little girl trip and fall. She begins to cry as the professor scoffed, saying that perhaps it was too much for a race that barely knew how to read. However, Van surprised everyone by giving an answer, a perfect and concise answer to the malicious question. The old man looked at him in astonishment, as the detailed explanation demonstrated his vast knowledge. With a confident smile, the young man asked if he desired a more in-depth discussion. That was enough to silence the professor, who then continued with the lesson. Since then, the blatant harassment had stopped completely. Ralph ran up to him and gave him a friendly pat on the back. Seeing the serious expression on her face, she invited him to lunch. Van responded vaguely that it was probably something related to him and folk. When they asked him to what he meant, he simply said that they had been a great help and walked towards the cafeteria. While commenting on how strangely he had been acting lately, a woman suddenly called out to the freshman, who turned to ask what she wanted. However, she frowned and told him that he had walked right past her. Van explained that he hadn't realized it, having done nothing wrong. They bowed politely and apologized to the upperclassmen, but he suddenly felt the tip of a sword just centimeters from his neck. Ralph panicked and demanded to know why she was doing something like that, even though it was expected. While commoners were expected to kneel before nobles, the gala were expected to crawl on the ground. Ralph argued that there was no need to go that far in. Van tries to help her up. The girl looks into his eyes and sees the glowing red orb within. Instead of being terrified, her eyes light up with childlike innocence, and she exclaims that an academy where everyone was ultimately a student. She refused to yield and tried to make him understand the situation he was in, bringing her even closer, plus the blade against his neck. Ralph defended his friend, stating that her behavior was out of line, even for someone of the upper class. She ordered him to stop being so stubborn and to obey her if he wanted a peaceful life within the academy. The former assassin was not someone to be intimidated by such insignificant threats. Basic respect between students of different courses was acceptable, but oppression was not something he was willing to tolerate. Seeing him grip his sword, she instinctively stepped back, fearing he would snatch hers. With the weight he applied to the thin blade, Van executed a quick and precise blow that broke the other end, causing it to fall loudly to the ground. By combining bending and twisting, he brought the metal to its broke through the limit with a precise strike. To point a sword without magical reinforcement at him was practically begging for it to be shattered. These types of weapons were typically only used for training and couldn't withstand actual combat. She mentioned that real swords weren't allowed on campus for those who belonged to Bright Crown. As Dan took note of the name, the girl turned around, adding that she had already fulfilled her part of the agreement. Another voice chimed in, confirming that he did, in fact, have fangs. Karina approached, listing his offenses and stating that he looked really cool, which surprises Van. The girl runs back to her friends and thanks him for helping her. Van hopes that one day, magical and non-magical humans was to act as a member of the disciplinary committee. The others were shocked to discover that the Sword Princess herself was present. On the other hand, Van knew her from a different time, when she held a much more terrifying title. She was known as the woman who reaped thousands of lives on the one battlefield. But what was she doing there? In Vanacino's first life, several rebellions rocked the kingdom. Behind these rebellions was a militant faction of purification sects known as the Circle of White Annihilation. The most feared among them was Karina, a demonic swordswoman, who had mastered all sword techniques and assassinated numerous heroes. The kingdom eventually destroyed the circle, but at an enormous cost. The chaos left in its wake subsequently ignited the struggle for succession to the throne. Van had only seen her once on the battlefield. So, why was the kingdom's sworn enemy now at the Magic Academy? Karina added another offense to her growing list. When asked what the problem was, he replied that it was simply rude to stare at her without saying a word. Van bowed to apologize, explaining that he sincerely hadn't realized she was an upperclassman. His words only managed to insult her even further. Ralph asked him to stop immediately and explained that she was one of the 5 crowns, but Van didn't even know what that group was. They were the 5 most powerful students in the MI, another presence, and that it feels dangerous. At that very moment, the follower suddenly drops dead, and a mysterious man with red eyes appears. Can come together, just as he and Inez have. Together, without a doubt, they will change the country. Later, as the night grows deeper, Van Academy, all hailing from families of the highest nobility. Karina had enrolled at just 13 years old, and was a true monster in terms of power. The explanation was enough for her to offer him a grateful smile. Van was surprised to discover that someone like her, he belonged to the high nobility. Undoubtedly, that information had been concealed after she became a rebel. Never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined meeting her at the academy. Perhaps this was his opportunity to stop the rebellion by eliminating her before her power reached its peak. That could halt the War of Succession before it even began, and destroy any possibility of Agnes ascending to the throne. He shook off those thoughts for the moment when Karina added yet another accusation. She coldly accused him of thinking about someone else while standing right in front of her. Seeing her carry the plast, with his hand on the hilt, Van immediately took a defensive stance. The blade slowly began to emerge from its sheath, reminding them that she was indeed permitted to carry a real weapon. Van recognized the stance. The surprise draw was her signature move, and her victims died so quickly that they didn't even see the sword. Ralph pleaded with him to apologize to avoid further trouble, but Van simply gestured for him to step aside. Adopting his own combat stance, he stated that there was something he needed to confirm. To her, his decision was utter foolishness, but he didn't care about her opinion. He finally arrives at his village after being away for 10 years and wonders if his family will be happy to see him. He remembers how his mother used to tell him that he should return. The air grew thick and still, and the onlookers could barely breathe in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Karina. He passed his target and completed his attack in the blink of an eye. The impact struck Ban, and the pain forced him to fall to his knees. Ralph's great concern grew. The shining crown remained silent. Surprisingly, it postponed his punishment for another time, and he left. After all, it would be a waste to get rid of someone like him too soon. The 2 boys watched her walk away in silence. As they walked through the empty hallway, a senior student asked why the offender had been forgiven. Karina suddenly fell to the ground, gasping for air, and stated that it wasn't that. She had forgiven him. Without saying anything else, she raised her hand to her chest, indicating the exact spot where she had been struck during the exchange. It was a completely unforeseen and unexpected turn of events. With a wife, when he returned to the village, and that if things got difficult, he could always come home. Lena, his sister, had promised him that, if he returned, she would cook the mushroom soup that he liked so much. Everyone hugged him and gave him a small amulet that would remind him how much they loved him and cared for him. However, to his absolute horror, his village is engulfed in a gigantic fire. Van acts immediately and checks to see if there is anyone wounded. He sees a man lying on the ground and checks if he is still breathing, but in the distance, he spots more people who are seriously injured. While the despair slowly washes over him as he wonders if all of this is due to a bandit attack, something far removed from their usual behavior, he is extremely worried. Worried, he runs home to see his mother, and as he runs desperately, he prays that they are safe and still alive. After all, the reason why he has fought for so many years for equality and justice for the Gala people is so that they can finally have a normal life. But he arrives too late. He sees his mother tortured, dead, and hanging from a tree. With his heart completely shattered, he hears his sister's faint voice calling out to him. She has also been brilliance, questioning if the boy seated on the throne is the second prince. The prince panics, fearing for his life. His swordsman, tortured, with her body completely covered in wounds. As she lies dying, she tells her brother to run away, because there are people who are looking for him. Van wonders whether they might be remnants of the second prince's faction. Seeing her struggling to stay alive, he begs her not to speak anymore and promises to take her somewhere safe. However, he knows her condition is critical due to the massive blood loss. As she clings to life, Lena whispers to him that she has become very good at cooking and that she was excited for him to try her dishes. She smiles weakly at him as her life ebbs away. Little by little, she touches his face for the last time and reminds him to never blame himself for what happened. Lena's hand falls lifelessly, an unmistakable sign that her life has ended. Van breaks down in tears, but suddenly a sword pierces his heart, wielded by one of the royal guards. The guards celebrate, proclaiming that they have defeated to the leader of the rebels. One of them prepares to stab him again, asking why he doesn't dodge the attack. With his heart shattered, Van replies that there is no one left he wants to protect, so he has no reason to keep living. The guard mocks him, finding him an easy target to defeat. Before accepting his inevitable death, Van questions why they had to die and who ordered their execution. Without hesitation, the guard replies that the newly crowned king ordered the massacre, as he considers all non-magic users useless to the country. Remembering he intervenes, drawing his sword. He recognizes the assassin by his glowing red eyes and declares that in their sacred kingdom, the only inferior and friend and the promise they shared, Van refuses to believe it, seeing it as a cruel twist of fate. Ines appears and greets her friend, the guards. They lower their heads in deference as Van, in disbelief, feels deeply betrayed to see that his good friend is responsible for the death of his family. Ines reveals that Van had become a threat, transforming into a lethal weapon capable of killing mages using only physical force and undetected by magic. If he wanted to, he could shake the foundations of the entire kingdom. Therefore, even before he could betray them, the king decided to eliminate him. Van slowly places his sister's body on the ground and declares that his friend has been deceiving him all this time. Ines responds that he will still fulfill his promise to eliminate discrimination against the Gala race. However, he will also exterminate them all. A guard attempts, he attacks Ban again, but this time Ban dodges the blow and stops the sword with his bare hand. Seeing Ban prepare to fight despite being seriously injured, wounded, Ines declares that Ban truly is a monster. The guards move into position to protect their king. Meanwhile, Vaughn jumps and uses the Sombre Galda style to strike against Ines. The king counterattacks using his magic, the Arrow of Light. The collision between the two creates a huge crater that completely devastates the village. Ines taunts his old friend, saying that even in his critical condition, Van is still fighting to protect his disgusting person who doesn't possess magic is someone like him, who they call Gala, the non-magical ones. Disgusted by his presence, the swordsman launches an attack against the Gala, without dead sister. That's the Van he knows. Even when facing death, he stands tall and refuses to kneel before the magical race. He considers him a fool, and he says goodbye, leaving Van with a huge void in his body. Later, as Van's body lies exposed, a seemingly magical creature approaches and offers him a second chance to live, to right his wrongs, and to take revenge. After a while, Van opens his eyes and looks down at his own hands and feet. Disoriented, he wonders if he is still alive as he tries to understand his surroundings. Somehow, the place seems familiar to him. Then he hears Elena's voice calling his name. He panics and is completely stunned to see her alive. Confused, she asks him if he's still half asleep and urges him to wash his face, join them for breakfast, and celebrate his birthday. Suddenly, His mother enters the room and congratulates him on his 15th birthday. Then Van realizes that he has gone back 10 years into the past. It's a sunny day, and his family is celebrating outside. Van is still in disbelief about what's happening. He wonders if all of this is just a long dream. A strong gust of wind blows, causing a flower to lose its petals. Van instinctively catches one of them with swiftness, which astonishes Lena. He then understands that the martial arts he trained in for so many years are still a part of him. Furthermore, the memories of the burning village, Elena's last words, his friend's betrayal, and the sword piercing his body remain as vivid as ever. However, even without magic, the Gala, whose name is Ban, manages to defeat the swordsman. Ban uses the fatal blow technique against his enemy, confirming to him that everything was real. Seeing him acting strangely, Lena approaches him to check if he is okay. Van assures her that he is fine and that she has nothing to worry about. Worry. Just then, their mother calls them to eat together and celebrate. Elsewhere, a woman rides alongside her guards, one of whom apologizes at her for failing to find any mages of A rank or higher anywhere else. She then criticizes the knights for their slow ability to response, pointing out that there were injured civilians. Then, he sees Gala village ahead of them. Unfamiliar with the place, one of the guards explains to her that the people of that village aren't exactly citizens of the kingdom, but livestock. The woman finds this disturbing, but says nothing, and simply continues riding. Meanwhile, back in the village, Van savors his favorite soup, commenting on how nostalgic it makes him feel. His mother, hey, and he finds it strange, since she had cooked the same dish for him just a few days prior. Van laughs nervously and admits that it's his favorite dish, which is why he always craves it. Lena sweetly tells him that she helped with the preparation. Van blurts out, without thinking, that explains why the ingredients were uneven. Annoyed, Lena turns to her mother to complain about Van. Then, Van looks fondly at the two most important people in his life, and realizes that he has been granted an opportunity to start over, 10 years in the past. However, he doesn't know what to do or where to begin.